All right, well, thanks for sticking around for the second part of our program this afternoon. I'm Greg Borowski, the Deputy Editor for News, Projects, and Investigations at the Milwaukee Journal-Sentinel. One of my favorite parts of the job is working on the O'Brien Project every year because it's always so ambitious and important, but also because I get to work with some, the top young journalists coming up in the profession, and then hopefully help them all get jobs once they're done. The role of the Journal-Sentinel, for those who aren't familiar with the project, is for all the years that this has been going on, we've had one of the seats in the fellowship, but we also try to work with all of the other visiting fellows. We've had cases where we've collaborated with them, co-published work. Sometimes it just amounts to, hey, we need some photos taken in Milwaukee and we're based in Arizona, can you help us? It's an opportunity, even as minimal it seems, but it's important for the journalists to come and hang out in the newsroom, meet a whole new community of journalists. If it gets too quiet over here on campus in the world of academia, they get to come and hear phones slam and people yell a little bit, and the newsroom environment that they fell in love with back when they got into the profession. My job this afternoon is to first introduce this panel and then help ask them some questions and take some questions from the audience. These are the people behind these great stories from this year, and it's a chance to sort of pull the curtain back a little bit on how the journalism gets done, and we'll hopefully have some good war stories. And there was a group hug going on here virtually before with Ryan when they all saw him on the screen. So you can tell that they certainly bonded over the course of their work. So let me start with introductions on the very far end. Over here, you all are familiar with Mark Johnson, who we just heard. Mark Hoffman, next to him, is a photojournalist at the Journal-Sentinel, where he's worked for the last 20 plus years. Before that, he's worked at the Associated Press, the Connecticut Post, and the La Crosse Tribune. And I'll tell you, he and Mark have often worked together on projects, and I like it as an editor because it gives me an out. So if I'm ever caught in my desk going, God, what was Mark thinking? This is ridiculous. I just don't understand it. And then one of them walks in. I'm like, oh, it's the other Mark. Don't worry about it. It's always the other Mark. Okay, next to Mark Hoffman is Davy Shastri, who is a graduate of the program from the spring. She spent the summer as the O'Brien intern in our newsroom. She is a newly minted full-time employee starting soon at the Oshkosh Northwestern. I've known Davy, I think, since she was a freshman, and I remember speaking to a freshman class, and she came up to me afterwards, and one of the first things out of her mouth was, do you know Mark Johnson? And I'm like, well, yeah, I know Mark Johnson. She's like, I would really love to meet Mark Johnson. I'm like, okay, it's really not as exciting as it sounds. He's just a guy, But over the years, I've watched Davy kind of work her way up through student media, and when you look at her background with a biomedical engineering degree and a journalism major, and you realize she's just a lot smarter than you. I figured we'd get her working with Mark, and that was a great payoff for us. McKenna Oxenden here on the end is a senior journalism major from Baltimore, Maryland. She's in the midst of her second O'Brien project, so we didn't scare her off with the first one, which is good. She's working with Aaron Richards on her project this year. And she has the distinguishing factor, I guess, is she had to wait the longest to see her story in print with Mark. It just ran this past Sunday, and she worked on a great story about math and algorithms with Mark. And I'm tempted to have her draw an algorithm on the board, but they didn't leave us a board. I'm also hoping that someday I'm in journalism long enough that McKenna can introduce me to some event, because it's like, it makes her sound really cool. All right, and on the big screens on both sides, Ryan, don't ignore the fact that you're like mega life size here for us. He's coming to us from Wyoming, where he's a reporter at the Sheridan Press, and he graduated back in 2017, back in May. And wave to us, Ryan, so we can all see you. I know you're hearing us, all right? Okay, so we're gonna get started with some questions, and I thought one way to just to start with is just to look at the way that Mark Johnson worked it out was when each of the students end up working very strongly on a specific story or specific angle with them, rather than all the students working on every piece of it. They took a real focused approach. So one of the first stories, the first story out of the gate was one Mark referenced earlier, I think, on Mahal, the orangutan at the Milwaukee County Zoo, and how he had died, and they found out it wasn't, just some fluke of nature, but that he had a tapeworm that was a newly found tapeworm that wasn't from the Milwaukee area and so forth. So that was Mark kind of kicked it off with this story that gave us a sense of, how these seemingly remote issues are really nearby and close issues. One of the next stories was the two Marks went to Kenya and to Nairobi, Kenya, and Uganda. They wrote about the urban areas and some of the problems with sanitation and other issues there and how they gathered that. And then we had a story where Ryan was involved. So we're going to ask Ryan the first question or two just to lay us out, where he got to go to Brazil, which is probably pretty cool. But I wanted to tell us first, Ryan, about tell us, because this is one of the little quirky war stories you wouldn't hear otherwise, but when you guys were getting your passports, I understand it was a pretty smooth process, right? Can you give us a sense of what it took to get you guys to Brazil? And then we'll talk about the reporting there, but go ahead on the first part.
Sure. Yeah. Even now I still can't quite believe that I was able to go to Brazil for a week, but I remember specifically we almost didn't make it in time. Me, Mark Johnson, and Mark Hoffman had taken a train down to Chicago because we had to visit the Brazilian consulate, I believe, to apply for our passports and everything. And I somehow had a wrong photo, or it wasn't exactly correct. So we were sprinting all around, running all around, going back and forth, literally running through downtown Chicago because the consulate closed at noon, I think. And I'm sprinting up there waiting for the elevator. I think I made it at about 11:57 a.m. And it was like the last day,
3 minutes,
just in the nick of time to make it, or else, all of our plans could have been ruined. So it was quite the interesting start for sure. But the overall experience was pretty great.
Yeah, so we wanted to give them a real experience on deadlines and the significance of deadlines and what would happen if you missed your deadline and all that. And he passed that, so then we said, okay, then you can actually go to Brazil with Mark and Mark. But tell us a little bit about that experience, reporting in a foreign country, and maybe what you picked up down there that you may have adapted or how that's helped you in your current job.
Yeah, it was way different for sure. Flying into Rio and driving to our hotel, seeing the city and everything. It didn't quite seem real at first, but yeah, we did a lot of traveling. Talked with pretty much everyone you could think of all across the spectrum. Health officials, doctors, researchers, but then also people who had gotten yellow fever, or who had family members who had died of it or survived it, way out in the jungle, basically. So we got to see both extremes, and worked with an interpreter who we couldn't have done it without her. But I guess the kind of thing that I most took away from it, I guess, just sort of an empathy for people in all situations, all walks of life. I guess I was able to kind of understand where people are coming from a little better. Talking with someone out in the jungle who barely had a house. But talking with them and kind of understanding what it was like to be like them just gave me a better understanding to be able to approach people, be able to connect with people, I guess, at a certain level, which I think is a pretty huge part of being a reporter and journalist is making that connection, at least a little bit.
Let me ask the two Marks about that trip and just how, because I think it's not like you just say, hey, we're going to go to Brazil and report this story. So talk a little bit about maybe Mark Hoffman first and then Mark Johnson about what it takes to even just get a trip like that on the books and plot it out so that you can come back in a week with the stories and things you came back with.
Well, the key thing for us is really preparation. So as Ryan talked about, one of the most important things when you're doing international work is having a fixer or a translator. And without our fixer in Brazil, her name was Nanda. She was great. We really relied on her a lot. We didn't speak Portuguese. She did. And for instance, our plane, we missed a whole day of reporting. We missed connected on our flight on the way down. We had everything tightly scheduled. You know, we made her find a mother. We said we really need to find someone who's been affected by the Zika virus. And she found this great story about a woman who decided to carry her child to term, and her husband left her because he didn't want to take care of a Zika baby. So the fixers are really worth their weight in gold. I just can't emphasize that enough. I mean, a lot of the credit to the story would go to her because, you know, just logistically to get from one place to the other, we couldn't have done it without her. And actually, the same thing goes for Africa. We had a translator and a driver there who we relied on a lot as well. So yeah, fixers are worth their weight in gold by far. But the big thing was we had a week to do it. So you're parachuting in someone's life and you're trying to get instant rapport with them. And as a photographer, that's really hard. And I'm sure for Mark, it was pretty hard as well. So you can take it from there.
Yeah, I mean, Mark's absolutely right that the translator fixer was just completely invaluable. I mean, we would not have been able to get the story without her. And at the very beginning, I think for about 3 weeks, she and I emailed like almost every day, and I was saying I would think of all these elements that the story needs. I mean, as it went along, I realized, you know, in that 1 week, ideally, I wanted to be able to get a chronology to tell each part of the story of yellow fever from the very first monkey that got sick and died to where we were now, where it was spreading to, it was getting closer and closer to Rio. I think it eventually got within 35 miles or 37 miles of Rio. And the amazing thing about it was, I mean, I kept telling her things, and just as a contrast, I had tried to arrange some of these things by myself for probably a good couple of weeks before we hired her, and I was getting nowhere. I mean, I was sending, you know, frantic emails in English, and getting very polite, you know, responses like, I don't know how we're going to be able to help you. But by the time that we actually got to Brazil, she had interviews set up with the very first doctor who treated a yellow fever patient and basically was the first person to diagnose the outbreak, to say that this is going on. We had, she found us a farm where they'd had dead monkeys, and all the elements of the story that we felt needed to go together. We had this sort of quasi-government agency that had been looking into all the different various causes, you know, or possible causes of the outbreak, because it wasn't, although it didn't become a huge story in the U.S. I mean, I think other than the New York Times and the Washington Post, I don't think too many places wrote about the yellow fever outbreak, but it was their worst on record since they've been, you know, having records. And she basically set us up with every kind of person that we asked for.
All right, let's talk a little bit now. We're going to pull Davey into the conversation because she got to go to Miami twice, right? Well, Miami and then Key West. This is pre-Hurricane Key West, so it's more fun than it might be to go today. But talk a little bit, if you could, about that story, but also what, you know, I know you went last year to Flint when you were working with Miranda Spivak on her project, but when we're in these conversations, we say, you know, we need to send someone to Miami, and it's really busy, and Mark's busy here. When did it kind of dawn on you that we were wanting to send you to Miami?
Wait, what was the last part?
Well, when did it dawn? How did you feel when you sort of maybe realized,
Yeah.
I'm going to Miami by myself to chase the story?
So I don't know how I always end up in this situation where everyone's like sitting around a table and they're like, who do we send? And they're like, that one. So I ended up going. And I had the experience, like you mentioned, of going to Flint and reporting on the lead crisis there. And just because I already had that under my belt, what happened was Miami ended up needing to happen very quickly. The turnaround was maybe like 2 weeks when we were like, we really need to get a ticket like to get to Miami. And I ended up going over spring break, which everyone thought was hilarious. But I was well behaved. And
You were only there for how many days?
I was there for 3 days.
She had, how many interviews did you have during that time?
I think I had like 7 or 8, maybe.
I mean, they were very full days.
Yeah.
And she even
so-
managed to get kicked out of, what was it, the Customs and Border
Gosh.
Patrol?
Okay, yeah. 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 Okay, so Miami was very rough. I think my second time around, the second time doing anything, like you kind of think like, oh, I got this. And you really don't because it's only your second time. But what ended up happening was while discussing the story about, so our third story in the series looked at third world cities, cities in developing countries, and this idea that it's easy to look at those cities, places like Nairobi, and say the disease threat there is obvious. It's harder to look at a US city and say the same thing because in a lot of ways it's not comparable, but in many other ways it is still a threat. And so the challenge for us was, where do we find a realistic and fair example in the US? And so the 2 places we were looking at was Miami and New York, right? Yeah.
I think we'd also looked at possibly Texas.
Yeah, and so we were looking at places where the animals were interacting with people in unexpected and new ways due to urbanization, which is obviously a growing trend as we all move out of rural areas and move into the city. And so the Zika outbreak had just happened in Miami, and so that was our obvious go-to. And then it was very quick, it dawned on me that I have to go, and then I had a week, and then I was like, all right, I'm gonna go through everything that's ever been reported on this, I'm gonna find all my sources, line up everything, and then just have everything set up when I go to Miami. So I ended up going to Miami, and then I ended up going to Key West, which, should I hold off on that?
Just describe that one.
Yeah, so Key West was later in the series. That was our 4th story, right? Yeah, and that story looked at kind of the challenges of
Man versus mosquito.
Yeah, the challenges of curbing the Aedes aegypti mosquito, which carries Zika and dengue and chikungunya and all these scary diseases, but also my story in going to Key West was looking at more of the political side of it. And so I ended up going there for 4 days. And one of those days was traveling, but I ended up doing 15 interviews in 3 days. And I drove over 400 miles because you can't get to the Florida Keys really any other way other than driving from Miami. And that was looking at this controversy that Key West had proposed a trial of genetically modified Aedes aegypti mosquito to release and curb the current population. And it's a new technology that has been tried a couple other times around the world. And what my sidebar to Mark's main bar was looking at was how you convince a wary public of a new technology.
This would have been the very first time that a genetically modified mosquito had been used in the U.S., and it proved very, very controversial.
Yeah, and they put it up for public referendum. It was a non-binding referendum, but they wanted to gauge what the public was thinking about a test. And so it was a very, very interesting case study into some of the issues beyond science. It's hard enough for scientists to figure out how do we control Aedes aegypti. And then when you come up with something that looks promising but still needs to be tested, because that's how science works, how do we convince and communicate that complicated information to the public?
All right, so I can say as an editor, when you're working with students, one of my mantras is kind of trust but verify. Okay, so I'm like, Davey's planning a trip, and I just said, let me just send her a note and say, how's it going? What have you got lined up? And I got back, it had to be like 5 minutes later, this minute by minute, moment by moment breakdown of what routes she's taking to get where, who she's talking to at what time. And she says, the response says, what do you think of that? And I'm like, my first thought was, well, plot in some bathroom breaks or something. You're there for a week, right? But no, she did great on that. Tell us just the little footnote on, because you don't speak Spanish.
No.
Right? Who was your translator?
Oh, this was fantastic. Okay, so when I went to Miami, I spoke with, so each situation, each trip required speaking with people who are members of the general public involved in these issues, and then researchers who are in the hotbeds of these issues. And so when I went to cover Zika, I spoke to two mothers who were expecting during the Zika outbreak. One contracted Zika and the other did not. And the one who did contract Zika and made a lot of headlines when she did only spoke Spanish. And so I was like, I have basic high school Spanish. I wish I could translate, but I can't. And so Mark, someone at the Miami Herald, right? You had a
Right.
connection?
Actually, Jill Williams at our paper, who's the features editor, knew somebody at the Miami Herald who was I caught her, I think, about 3 days before she left the Herald to the New York Times.
Yeah.
And it just so happened that she knew a former editor at the Herald who was just a terrific, reporter and Spanish and English speaker, bilingual.
And we were worried because we were like, wow, we're really pushing the budget here. Like, where are we going to get the money for this? And how much is it going to cost? We need to map it all out. And so Mark sent an email and said, hey, this person from Marquette University is showing up in Miami. She's a student. Can you help her? And he responds back, happy to help. And also a proud Marquette alum, so I'll do it free of charge. He said, I'll do it for pro bono. And so I got to meet that Marquette alum, and he got to reminisce about Marquette, and he helped me out. And it was a unique experience because he is an award-winning journalist, very good at what he does, which I didn't fully realize when I showed up there to meet him, and I got out of the car with this giant backpack and all this stuff, and he's like, you look like a journalist. And so we go in, and I'm asking all these questions, and he didn't say a single thing. And my photographer, we had a freelance photographer, mentioned later on, he's like, that guy's a real big shot, and it's interesting that he didn't make any comments on what you were saying.
It's Juan Tamayo,
yeah,
right?
Yeah, Juan
Who's
Tamayo.
a Pulitzer Prize winner, I believe. So that's how we roll. We get Pulitzer people to just be our translators on these trips, through the Ryan Conference. All right, let's go to McKenna here, who did not get to go to Brazil, did not get to go to Miami. She got to stay here in Wisconsin and work on math. So the first question is, how much do you hate your fellow students who got to go on these cool things when you didn't?
Careful.
But more, a lot, a little? Give us a rating.
Definitely a little bitter.
Okay, she's
I got to go to warm places. I got to go across, to all these
to go to
cool
4th
places.
and State Street to come to our office
Yeah.
a couple times.
Right, and I just stayed in Johnston Hall in a room with no windows.
Yeah. Okay. So we'll all remember that when we're trying to hire McKenna in the spring because she didn't get to go to these fun places, but did great work. So tell us a little bit about your story. This was the one that ran just the other day, and it's really one of the key stories, I think, in the whole project, because when Mark Johnson pitched it to the O'Brien board, it wasn't just, hey, let's write about these diseases. It was, what if we could, in the future, predict these outbreaks before they happen? And everyone around the table was kind of like, really? Is that a real thing? Can it happen? And this is the story that had to show that it was an actual real thing and that it could happen. So tell us a little bit about that story and your work on it.
So Mark was really great in the way that he kind of set it up, like Greg talked about a little bit earlier, that he kind of just came up with these story ideas and was kind of like, all right, everybody pick and choose on what you're interested in. And I sat there and I kind of looked at the stories and I was like, I don't know, for some weird reason I'm kind of drawn to this algorithm story, which is really strange because I really, really hate math. And I just kind of looked at it and I was like, this would be kind of fun to push myself outside my comfort zone. So I decided to, I was like, all right, I can do this. And Mark was like, great, all right. And he's like, how do you feel about, tackling to figure out what an algorithm is, and how to tell our audience what it is? And I said, sure, okay, whatever you say, you're the boss. And so I talked a lot with different researchers that were working in the field to figure out, how they collect data, how they use their data. And then, of course, we talked a lot with a lot of scientists and researchers of is this even possible to use mathematic algorithms to predict future outbreaks? And I think one of the best analogies that we kind of got is the same way that, being able to predict hurricanes and tsunamis and, snowstorms and things like that, that's uses algorithms. So, once upon a time that didn't exist, but now it does. So the idea of being able to predict, infectious disease outbreaks is entirely possible. We had a few negative Nancys and, people from the other side that were like, I think this is kind of not entirely true. But I think it's kind of safe to say that for the most part that, within the next several years, it's something that's going to be prominent and we're going to see, and there's a lot of really, really great work being done to try and do this, because the point is that, we know these diseases exist, so why are they happening when we know that we can try and prevent it and prepare people?
Do you remember what the first step we took was? We went to a math prof here at Marquette to have him explain to us what algorithms are and how they are used for things. Because I was actually counting on you, McKenna, to be the good one in math, because basically I didn't take a math course in college. And
yeah, I barely passed
high school
statistics,
math.
so that was a wrong assumption.
So many of you may be aware that the stereotype of journalists is, well, they're in writing and words because they're no good at math. So first, McKenna's put that to rest. So she should have no trouble getting hired. She ought to just be able to say, look, I did the math story. And if that's one of the questions, like, no, I did the math story. Okay. But I have one specific question for McKenna, since she's good at math. We've just established that, right? Okay. So if two journalists get the same assignment while traveling in opposite directions, and they're both 50 miles away from their newsroom, one has drinking a cup of caffeinated coffee and one decaffeinated coffee, which one gets their story filed first?
It depends. Are we driving in a normal car, or are we driving in a Mark Johnson car that has bungee cords that close the door?
Okay. That's actually the correct answer. See, she got that one. All right. So we've heard about the different parts of the project. I want to take a few minutes to focus on the students, but also get some input from the two Marks on how they did. But I want to start with get Ryan back into the conversation here of, okay, and realizing for Ryan, so you can tell there's just like 1,000 people in this room, and they all, everyone I said your name, they all leaned forward in their seats, so they're waiting for your response. But many of them are students, and give us a sense, you're a student, you're a senior at that point, when a junior, I guess, when you applied to be in the program, but you meet Mark Johnson, Pulitzer Prize winner, you got this massive project coming, how does that feel? How do you react to that? How do you sort of get yourself in the place that you're going to be able to be a real contributor to something like this?
I was really excited initially.
Then you learn more.
Go ahead, Ryan.
Oh, okay. I was really excited to work with Mark. Did some research on him. Obviously, super accomplished journalist. I did kind of, I didn't really have much of a science background at all. I took biology for non-science majors, and that was about it. So I did like a fair amount of just general science reading before actually meeting Mark, just to try to get familiar with what we might be doing. But then once I actually met him, it was really cool. Just kind of how Mark treated me as an equal, I guess. Was always wanting to bounce ideas, or get my input, stuff like that. Initially, it was a lot of research, reading these pretty dense scientific papers, trying to go over them, just looking for interesting nuggets or possible like expert sources to talk to, and then reaching out to those sources. So that was kind of what I thought most of my time would be, just background research, the occasional interview, transcribing a lot of interviews, which is stuff that I did. But I also did a lot more. Mark and I had dual interviews, either that he had set up or that I had worked out. And then obviously going to Brazil was the main thing. And I really just learned a ton from Mark on how to, I guess, the types of questions to ask, and how to approach people. I'm still trying to catch up with Mark for his note-taking ability. Yeah, I don't know. I learned a lot. I'm not sure if I hope that specifically answered your
Yeah.
question.
All right, let me ask both Marks, but Mark Johnson first in particular. So, in a newsroom, often we get requests, hey, someone wants to come job shadow or meet, and it's sort of like, oh, I'm not really doing anything exciting today, but I suppose I can entertain a person for an hour or whatever. Now, Mark, you're working with these students for the whole academic year. What was your take on, how did you determine how much you could give to them and how much they could do? And did you have any trepidation at the start too of what will the students be able to do?
I hadn't worked with students on a project before, but I think I very quickly came to the conclusion that, and I've always thought this about journalism, that it's not so much, how many courses you've taken or your, even your talent. I think it's your desire. And one of the things that, Ryan's probably forgot this, but I got an email from him during Christmas break because he'd spotted an article in the New Yorker about gene drives. You got to it before I did, and he correctly saw that it would be something that we would want to write about, and we did. And I mean, before this year, you ever heard of gene drives? Probably.
Yeah, I'm not sure who he's looking at. I think he's looking at Ryan. Ryan probably hasn't heard it. I'm gonna venture you haven't heard of gene drives before that point.
It was a great thing. I mean, each one of the student reporters added something like that. I mean, McKenna came up with an idea that's going to be our next story on airlines and communicable diseases. That was just an idea that she came up with, and it was just right on target because we kept hearing from experts about how this was one of the key changes in sort of our modern world, that diseases can, jump continents, in no time at all. And when I went back and looked, there weren't actually a lot of news or feature stories on that subject. So it was a good pick. And Davey was great because I have to admit I've struggled. I've been a science reporter now for about 8 years, and I still have to really work my way through scientific papers. I mean, there's times where it just feels like my brain is this bicycle and I'm pedaling as fast as I can just to, try to understand it. And so I don't know if you knew what I was doing, but sometimes I would give her a paper that I was reading and I'd say, I'd just like to get your take on it too. And it was a really good way of making sure that I hadn't misunderstood it. So it was, I think they, very quickly I learned that they had a lot to add to the project. And I knew from the start it was going to be much better than anything I could do by myself.
Yeah, next year we're going to name this panel After the Rose, so we can hear what, all the confessions and the problems and what went on. So Mark Hoffman, can you talk a little bit, you got to witness and see, Ryan and Mark working together in the field, and what were you expecting? Because you probably haven't been working with student journalists like that either. What were you expecting, and what were they able to deliver?
I'm not used to having, in fact, I rarely take job shadows with me because most of the time it's like a student says, I have this class project, I might want to be a photojournalist. So I usually don't take those people for job shadows. So it was real interesting when we met Ryan. He's full of enthusiasm. And one of the things, when we go out on assignments together, whether if I'm just with Mark or in this case I was with Ryan, we work as a team. Sometimes Mark might be asking a question and I might be thinking a question ahead, or Ryan might be thinking 2 questions ahead, or someone might say, hey, did you notice that over there? We really, the three of us, probably, 1 + 1 + 1 equals, in this case, probably 4. It really helps the outcome. Just having that person taking that step back always, looking at the bigger picture, what's going on. So I thought it was invaluable having Ryan along. And Brazil, I think, was a great trip for everyone, and Ryan was a key part of that trip.
I have to add one thing that, I don't want his professors here to think that we took him to like beaches and it was like super, super fun. I think we were there for like 6 days, and I think we drove over 1,200 miles. Well, you, Mark Hoffman, drove over 1,200 miles, and we kind of rode. And Ryan, for the most part, stayed awake much of the time. He did very, very well. And they were really long days, like 11 and 12
talking to each
hours.
other after the trip, too, which is good. Davey, let me ask you a question so when you begin the same sort of thing at the start of the program, anybody, a reporter, professional, anybody would have sort of, here's, boy, my greatest fear about what this will be and what I think the greatest success will be. So describe those and then tell us sort of where this effort and program fell on that spectrum.
The greatest fear and the greatest hope.
Yep.
Okay. I'll start with the fear. I think the greatest fear is just like not missing out on an opportunity. And I think when and maybe this is just the type of person I am, but hopefully not, because it makes me sound super anxious. But like I felt like I had 4 years here, 2 years in which I qualified to do O'Brien, and 2 years in which I did O'Brien. And I felt like that's like time slipping away. And there's no other, like I've met lots of professional journalists. Like I just email people and just say, can you talk to me? And I've told them about my experiences, and so many of them, almost all of them, have said that they never would have imagined having the experience that I had as an undergraduate through O'Brien. And so my fear was always, will I be able to work well enough with my fellow to get the most out of it? But my hope was always that I would do as much as I could, but also I think going into something like this when you're young and starting out and don't know much about really anything, is that like I had a lot of trust in both of my fellows, both times around. The first year I worked with Miranda Spivak, who was a freelance journalist who used to be an editor and reporter for the Washington Post. She focuses on transparency issues in state and local government. Like these are leaders in our field both times around, and the one thing I knew is that like if I trust them and then also like guide them a little bit, because they're professionals and they haven't been teachers and they don't know necessarily how to work with a student, but tell them what I need, I'll get as much as I can out of it.
All right, and let me ask this question now of McKenna, a slightly different question, then we're going to take some questions from the audience, so start thinking of those. But McKenna, so a lot of the people in the audience are students who we hope will become O'Brien, future research assistants and interns and such. Talk a little bit about what pulled you into the program, what allowed you to be successful, and then give them whatever your top piece of advice is that they need to do besides learn math. Or in Ryan's case, sprint a lot, so you can get your passports. But
Yeah, I mean, I'd say the O'Brien program is unlike anything else literally across the country. I mean, when in your undergrad career are you going to be able to, in most places, work with a professional journalist and have your work be, on a, potentially nationwide level or a wider audience? And, the added fact that, Mark is a Pulitzer Prize winning journalist, and like that could potentially be a once in a lifetime opportunity. You might not ever work with somebody of that caliber again. So coming into it, I remember freshman year in Dr. Gardner's class, she always brings in the O'Brien Fellows to, chat, and I was totally fascinated by everybody's projects. I mean, all the projects are always absolutely dynamite, and, I went up right away to just chat with them and, hear more. And I remember sophomore year, Justin George was from the Baltimore Sun, and being from just outside Baltimore, I was totally bummed that as a sophomore, I wasn't able to do it. So, you see these projects, and I think it's just inspiring of, the journalism that can be done and the journalism that will be done in the future. And in order to get here, if you're serious about journalism and you're serious about working for O'Brien, It's never too early to start laying the groundwork and start whispering into Dave's ear and all the other fellows' ear, hey, I'm really interested in this. You know, and if you're not involved in student media, you should change that. Because newsflash, people and professionals don't want to see your work done in journalism class that's unpublished. They want to see published work. They want to see that you have been writing and writing and writing. And not only that, you know, we have really, you know, great connections. Greg is always constantly, you know, coming in, or we know that he's a phone call or an email away, maybe sometimes much to his dismay, that we can bother him. Of, you know, creating these connections and making sure that if O'Brien is what you want to do, that it's there. You know, I mean, I'd say it's all about paving your own way, taking the bull by the horns, having the initiative to do what you want to do, promote yourself, and, you know, just put yourself out there, which can be sometimes scary, but, you know, you're going to get a huge benefit out of it.
All right, so I'm officially out of material, so I have no more good jokes, but I'm interested in some questions from the audience. And the reminder is you press the little thing on what is officially told, I'm told that the doohickey, and that'll allow it to be allowed. So in the front row, all right, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. This is a very exciting program, and I've been on the other end of being interviewed a lot. My question to you is, was there one top piece of advice or technique? Oh, okay, sorry. So being at the other end of being interviewed, was there some best piece of advice or technique, something that you learned that you found to be the most useful in extracting the key information that for many scientists, certainly scientists, can be pretty hard to get? Any secrets that you said, aha, that one really worked, and I didn't know that before?
All right, let's have Davey take that one. We'll try to just have like maybe one or two people answer each so we get through more questions, but Davey, go ahead.
Okay, so to answer this question, I have to go like into before O'Brien a little bit, but I wanted to be a science writer since freshman year when like I was like, who's Mark Johnson? And like freaking out, big fan. So I've been in the middle. I studied biomedical sciences and journalism, did a minor in neuroscience. So one of my profs is right there. So like I learned the science and that was very helpful, but you can't obviously know everything. And so then as I started to write, one of my earlier internships was actually at Science Magazine in DC, which is what publishes the science journals. And what I learned there was that there were a lot of people who had science backgrounds, even up to PhDs, who were science reporters for that journal. And even though they probably knew what was being explained to them, they played dumb. And I think that is the best way to do it. And that took me a long time to master because it's hard to get over your ego and say, like, act like you don't know anything or just admit that you don't know anything. But the best thing for me in terms of interviewing scientists was always to just get them to explain it as much as possible. And then work back through it with them. Because another big challenge is researchers in many cases fear oversimplification of their work because it can come up across as inaccurate to their colleagues. And that's not anything we ever intend to do, but if we need to explain something in the Milwaukee Journal-Sentinel to whoever's picking it up on the street, it needs to be palatable for anyone who doesn't have a science background. And so it's much easier to work through that with your source rather than trying to do it yourself. And I think Mark will probably mention this, but he works back and forth with his sources a lot, especially his key sources, to make sure that everything makes sense but is understandable. So in a lot of situations where it's easy to think of it as a one-sided thing, where it's like we're the journalists and we need to get the answers, in science reporting it's definitely two-sided.
Okay, let's try to take a couple more questions. Let's go with Dr. Bob.
There we go. Yeah, Bob Griffin, professor. Oh, two of them. Okay, stereo. Emeritus in the Department of Journalism. I think the Journal-Sentinel better be ready for another Pulitzer based on this series. And if I could award it a special award, I would give it to this article on algorithms and mathematical modeling that just appeared this last Sunday. That was one of the toughest jobs in reporting I could imagine. And it wasn't statistics, it was statistical reasoning and mathematical reasoning that's more important. And it was pulled off extremely well. One thing I'd like to hear, and McKenna talked a little bit about how the idea came about, but it was written so well. And that's also very tough to do. What strategy did you use? How did you put together the structure of that article? Because it really, really came across to folks, I think.
Yeah. Why don't you, McKenna, why don't you go, and then Mark can jump in.
So that's one of the first things Mark and I talked about was like, how are we going to get people to want to read this article? And so, we started talking to people in the field, and many of these people are across the world. So we just kind of sent an initial email with, the basic questions of, who are you? What are you doing? And one of the things we talked about is like, how do you collect your data? And we got the craziest stories from these people. And it was a goldmine. One of the responses, which is what we led with in our lead, was one of the researchers had to participate in a seance and get permission from the dead before she went to go collect data. And participate in a ritual in, I think it was like an African village. Another researcher chased a marabou stork because it had swallowed the bat that she needed to collect a blood sample from. People were in a canoe with no water or electricity for days on end, and just all of these crazy stories. And so it was an incredible testament to like what people go through to get this data to propel the future forward in science and in math and predicting these algorithms. But it was also like, holy cow, we can relate this as to just to make it absolutely interesting for people. And so we knew that was going to be a good chunk of our story, because if trying to talk to the dead doesn't capture your attention, I don't know what will.
Yeah. Mark, go ahead.
The first thing I'd say is that we spent a long time, I think a good month, talking about the lead, because as McKenna said, we didn't know how we were going to make a math story, really interesting. I think that it was one of these cases where you were fighting this idea that it was dull but important, really important. And I mean, my operating theory is that the dull part is only because you're looking at it a certain way. And initially, we were looking at the mathematicians and the people who were developing these algorithms. And I think we had decided, I forget how the idea came about, but we asked one of them, where does the information that you use to build the algorithm, where does it come from? And that's when we got the idea, we got the response that it was from these people in the field who spend sometimes 30 or 40 years, developing an expertise. It's the kind of thing that often it's referred to as sort of basic science, and when I've written about it before in the Journal Sentinel, sometimes I almost always get dispiriting comment to the effect of, well, that's your text always at work or something. And this was a really good chance to show that there, even if knowledge for knowledge's sake isn't good enough, there's actually, to a lot of this work, there's a real payoff. One of the other things that sort of came about, you talked about the structure. Well, the history of it kind of interested me, and for a number of the stories, we tried to sort of work in a history component. And I had no idea, like, how long people had been using mathematics, to look at it as a way to look at and explain and understand infectious diseases. That part was interesting. And then when we actually got into the real weeds of like how does this work? How does it actually crunch out, something useful? To me, that was actually, it was difficult because it was piece by piece kind of understanding, and a lot of the time what happens Davey mentioned this, is that we write something and it's not quite accurate, or there's something that we haven't quite got right. And I think that that's one of the parts of the process that, in a way, it's endlessly humbling, but it's a good part of the process. I tend to go back and forth with scientists, and on really technical stuff, I'll show them, this is what I'm writing. Is this correct? And sometimes what happens is it's a way that it almost works, I think, like some of those algorithms. It brings you closer and closer to something that's correct. Your mistakes sort of end up teaching you a lot. And it just so happened that we had some really good, we talked to some researchers who did an excellent job of sort of explaining what they do. This was the issue that Dr. Patz brought up. Well, I have one thing for scientists and mathematicians that would be sort of a piece of advice. And it's more something that for a very long time I've sort of carried around this idea that even people who do really, complicated, complex work, it's got to be something I can explain. I mean, I've written one story that was about Mach theta functions. And my theory is that at some point, usually probably Thanksgiving or Christmas, they sit down with their relatives. And Cousin Fred asks, so what have you been working on? And there's got to be a way that you explain it to your family members who aren't experts in math or science. And it's just a matter of starting to think about it that way, almost as if you were having a really nice conversation in a restaurant, and in a way, you're taking somebody who's possibly not interested in something or thinks they're not, and you're sort of showing them that, wow, once you pull the curtain back, it's actually pretty damn interesting.
All right, that may be a good spot to end it, but I think appropriately, because it's kind of a good commercial for an underlining of why the O'Brien program is so important. So in a normal newsroom, if a reporter comes to you and says, hey, I want to do this story about math, and I'm going to spend a month talking about the lead, they're going to be sent right out to the street to get a story more quickly. So what the O'Brien Fellowship does is it's an incredible blessing in the world of journalism. It gives you that time away. It gives you access to the resources and researchers and professors and people at Marquette, but in other places, it gives you the students to take that project that, Mark couldn't have done. We'll have like 7 or 8 installments of this thing when we're done. He couldn't have done that in a year on his own. He couldn't have done it in 2 or more years probably, but we're able to accelerate it. You give the students the great experience, which we saw, including from Ryan, who so patiently is waiting from Wyoming saying, come on, Greg, get done. I got to go to the bathroom here, right? Okay. All right, so we'll let you off the hook in just a second, but let's say thank you to the panel, and then I think Dave wants to maybe say a few words. So thanks, guys.
Before we say goodnight, I want to thank all of our panelists tonight, all of our guests for the insights and time, and Ryan for being so patient with us. I want to thank the audience, though, first and foremost, because we really appreciate your coming out and supporting this kind of journalism. And we are, in fact, taking this show on the road. The O'Brien Conference will be following its journalists back to their home cities to do public forums. So if you're interested in a group tour, maybe we could get a rate and go to Naples and Minneapolis. But in all seriousness, we hope to see you back here for the 6th conference next year. Thanks a lot.